Warami Mitiga. Hello friends. Ujuri na Junior Dharug Nurua. Good to see you on Dharug country. Welcome to 11 stories from the River Dyarubbin's audio walk at Pughs Lagoon, Marrang Ngurra, Richmond. Naya Josh. My name's Josh.
Naya Beau. My name's Beau.
Nilaya Dharug Burrabarungal Nuriin. We belong to the Burrabarungal Grey Kangaroo clan of the Dharug people. Bajingun, Gubanga, Ganingang, Yura, Gudugulung, Yagu, Arabagu, Dharug, Yura. We pay our respects to our elders, past, present, and emerging. Yanawijiung, Manawiwa, Muru, Warunga. Walk with us in the footsteps of our ancestors. Nara, Dabuamili, Dyarubbin, Waradya, Murubadu. Listen to the story of our Dyarubbin and the lagoons, creeks and waterways that feed her. Dyarubbin's floodplains were once adorned with Waradya lagoons. In Dharug, our language, these Waradya lagoons have names like Mara, fingers, goodbye, riverarm, Marrang Ngurra, little leg.
Names of animals that live in them, like Bulungai, place of quolls, mulgu, black swan, or resources that can be found there, like Gudugulung, place of cobs. Some, like Yarramundi Lagoon, carry the names of our Wurundjeri ancestors. These Waradya remind us that Dyarubbin Ngurra, the river country, is a living, breathing being, carrying our songlines and our dreaming, sung into existence from creation.
Remember Mitiga, tread softly on this dreaming. We were strong here. We remain strong here. We will always be strong here.
Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander listeners are advised that this audio walk contains stories of historical violence and Aboriginal people now resting in the dreaming. Listen and enjoy the stories, but please do not reproduce them in any way. Dyarubbin. Thank you.
Kui Yanma. Come, let's walk alongside this Waradya and stop for a while near the picnic shelter and look out over the lagoon. Grace Karskens, Emeritus, Professor of History at the University of New South Wales and author of People of the River.
All along Dyarubbin, on both sides of the river, there are many, many lagoons, still today. But 200 years ago, there were many more. They stretched like a necklace of mirrors right along the banks of the river. They're actually really ancient bodies of water too, because they're the water left behind in the swales after the river slowed and narrowed and deepened over millennia. And then of course they become really ecologically rich places. They attract lots of food plants, lots of animals and bird life and water creatures like turtles and platypus, eels, fish. And so, of course, they are also people magnets. They're such rich places. They are the places where Aboriginal people, right up and down the east coast of Australia, it's where they gathered and where they camped, where they harvested and fished. There was plenty of food for everybody. They would have been good places for many people to come together for corroborees or for contests where the law was enacted.
Burrabarungal artist and knowledge holder Leanne Watson.
The lagoons I've always thought they're really important because to me they're full of medicine and resources, and they sort of stand out to me as women's places. Even right across the Cumberland Plain, like all of our creeks, a lot of them are chains of ponds as well. So they're like waterholes. So that's why I tend to paint chains of ponds or waterholes or lagoons. The waterhole formations are really common. And then along the river, next to the river, the lagoons are like big medicine places.
Waradya are also a magnet for water birds, which are a food source for our people and early settlers. Nyalawa, sit a while, and look out for the local birds with Mark Fuller, the birdman of Western Sydney.
That's the swamp hen. He's found his little spot. And he likes reed beds. The larger purple swamp hen, they're quite happy to walk on grass, and they're probably the most terrestrial of those swamp hens, moorhens. Then you've got these guys that are in the middle. They're called dusky moorhens, just around the muddy edges. See how they've found the muddy edge where you've got that gradual slope. And then the other guys you'll get that are a bit like those are the coots. They're the ones with the big white shield, and they'll be out in the middle of the water because they dive. So the three birds all look similar, same family, but one likes the dry land, one likes it in the middle, and one likes it out by the water. You know, demonstrates well how they have their different habitats.
We only had a handful of names for places along Dyarubbin until a fantastic discovery in the Mitchell Library in Sydney in 2017 was Reverend McGarvey's list of native names for the Hawkesbury. And on that list are 178 Dharug and Darkinjung names for Dyarubbin, the Hawkesbury River. The McGarvey list names 25 lagoons, which just shows you how important they were in Dharug and Darkinjung culture and geography on Dyarubbin. The names that we have stretch all the way from Mari Mari in Richmond right down to Beroma, which was a once vast lagoon and wetland down at Sackville. A lot of them tell us something about the country, so they might be named for birds, like Beruma or Birama is a reference to the ducks that no doubt lived there, and Gubai, it seems to mean arm, which might suggest that the Dharug people thought of it as an arm of the river, which it originally was. So these names are fascinating because they really conjure up that lost geography that was really destroyed in the wake of colonisation. And there are even different names related to the word for lagoon, Waradya, Warang, Warade, Warakia, which seem to describe the kind of lagoons that they were. So a double lagoon, a large lagoon, a long lagoon. This really brings to mind a lost watery world where water just trickles and gushes and wells and pools in lagoons and wetlands and creeks and ponds along Dyarubbin. Unfortunately, over the decades, many settlers drained and destroyed the lagoons, mostly for grazing or for more agricultural land, to the point where today almost 80% of the lagoons along Dyarubbin have been destroyed or severely damaged.
To me, all the lagoons are really important, and I love how the language it's brought back, how we had explained all of these different places as parts of the body, shows the connection that we had to those places. I've got to look at the landscape around those lagoons too, because there's some of those that have got the higher points, and then you've got some of them that are near flatter areas. It's not just that lagoon alone, it's what's surrounding it or what was done at those places.
One of the named lagoons on McGarvey's list is Marrang Ngurra. It's very close by, over the other side of Kurrajong Rd, the main road beyond this lagoon and a bit closer to the river. Marrang Ngurra in Dharug, our language, means like the fingers of a hand. It's one of a string of long thin lagoons, connected by creeks, which stretch along the Richmond lowlands, tracing an almost parallel path to the river. It's also possible that it was named for one of our leaders, Marrang Ngurra. Perhaps it was his birthplace. Like many of our places, it's now on private land, country which our ancestors had tended for tens of thousands of years, which the British government assumed without any negotiations with our people, and started granting to ex-convict settlers along the river near Windsor in 1794. By the early 1800s, Free settlers were arriving in the area, and Marrang was part of a 100-acre grant to the widow Mary Pitt in 1802, the only woman amongst several free settlers who were granted land in this area by Governor King in 1802, including Edward Pugh, after whom this lagoon is likely named. Near Marrang is a rock engraving of an emu, one of several along the river, and in 1827, Mary Pitt's grandson, George Matcham Pitt, then just 13 years old, wrote down an emu hunting song he heard there from our ancestors.
George Matcham Pitt became an architect and designed the Richmond Park Grandstand, Belmont Park Homestead on Richmond Hill, and the Old Windsor Hospital.
The local reminiscences of the Hawkesbury that were written down later in the 19th century and published by settlers are full of stories about Aboriginal people. And one of those stories was about the way that settlers learnt how to treat snakebite. The way that Aboriginal people treated snakebite was to bind the lower limb, put a pebble in your mouth to ward off evil, and suck out the venom directly from the wound. But the thing is to rinse the mouth frequently so that you yourself wouldn't be poisoned by the venom. And one of these stories is about Robert Pitt and his wife Sarah. He'd been born in the 1810s and obviously grew up with Aboriginal people like his brother George Matcham Pitt at Richmond, learning from Aboriginal people. One day Sarah was bitten by a deadly snake, possibly a brown snake, and her husband tries to use the Aboriginal way of curing her. Unfortunately, he forgot to rinse his mouth out and he was soon in very big trouble himself, poisoned by the snake venom that he had swallowed. Then everybody called for the local Aboriginal people to come and help, as well as the doctor, and they all arrived, and it's because of the Aboriginal people that they were both saved. We don't know where these Aboriginal people were living, but it was possibly on the local lagoons, one of which was Marrang, which was the lagoon on the Pitt family farm.
We're on a little strip of land here between two long, skinny, finger-like lagoons, which both continue on the other side of the busy main road beyond the trees ahead. We'll wander along the grass to the end of this side of the Waradya lagoon and then walk back alongside the other Waradya. Dyarubbin traces her ancestry back to the mountain ranges of Gondwana land. This floodplain used to be the riverbed of a much larger, faster flowing river. We're walking on sands and gravels that were laid down over hundreds of thousands of years. The terrace above the other side of the lagoon, on which Marrang Ngurra, the town of Richmond, sits, is an even older riverbed.
I'm Kirsty Fryers. I'm a professor in the School of Natural Sciences at Macquarie University. I study the processes by which water shapes the Earth's surface. Well, over millions of years, the Hawkesbury catchment was part of Gondwana. So there were big sandbed river systems on the Gondwanan continent, and that created the Hawkesbury sandstone. So that's now the bedrock that is confining the Hawkesbury River. And inset within that, the gravels that sit in the bottom part of the valley, they're hundreds of thousands of years old, and they were deposited by a much more energetic river system. A bigger river, so the channel size was much bigger, but also the amount of water flowing through that landscape was a lot larger at that time, largely due to different climate. So I am really interested in the floodplain wetlands. There's different types of floodplain wetlands that we can see on the Hawkesbury and surrounding tributaries. If you've got relatively long, linear, finger-line wetlands on your floodplain, they are probably sections of channel, and we call them paleo channels. They'll be the old channels left on the floodplain. So they are the old course of the river system. And the more circular shaped ones that are positioned away from the channel are probably back swamps. So the terraces are the old floodplains of those ancient rivers, probably comprised of those really cohesive gravels. This is where floodwaters will go out and dissipate over that floodplain and deposit the fine-grained materials further away from the channel.
My name's Dr. Michelle Ryan. I'm a lecturer in ecology and environmental science at Western Sydney University, and I am the Hawkesbury Nepean waterkeeper. Wetlands play a really important role cleaning water for us. So water comes into the wetlands, and the wetlands function as kind of the kidneys of the river. So they will clean up the water before it then flows onto a river system. Different types of plants in the wetlands, the sediment, so the soil underneath the water in the wetlands, and the microbes and the water bugs and everything that lives in it plays a role in removing things like excess nutrients, which will help those wetland plants grow. It slows down the flow of water, so the water will flow slowly. It allows for sediment, so silt and mud, to drop out and go to the bottom of the wetland. So that helps clean up the water before it goes into the river. So wetlands provide habitat for a huge number of species. So turtles, eels, other fish species, water bugs. And in the Hawkesbury, we're really lucky that we have a lot of migratory birds that come and make the Hawkesbury home for part of a season. So those wetlands are extremely important.
If you haven't already, let's cross over under the trees to the Waradya lagoon on the other side of this strip, where the reeds and baraba bulrushes nestle along the lagoon edge. If we could continue south along this Waradya, which has been partly filled in to carry Kurrajong Rd, we would come to the colonial estate of Hobartville, the name given to the land by the grantee and surgeon Edward Luttrell in 1804. The estate subsequently gave its name to the suburb Hobartville and has also become famously known in the 1930s as the most successful Hereford cattle stud in Australia. Hobartville Homestead is just beyond here, just up off the floodplain. Historian Grace Karskens.
The Luttrell family at Richmond, they got a 400-acre grant taken from Aboriginal people on really lovely land on the flats there. The Luttrells were always a problem. The father was a surgeon and he was a drunk and he was a pain in the butt, basically, to the government. He had about 4 sons and they were a nuisance to Aboriginal people. Robert Luttrell was apparently notorious for taking Aboriginal women, raping Aboriginal women, and in the end he got hit over the head with a waddy in 1811 and his skull was cracked and he died a few weeks later. A waddy is a club, a wooden club. The leader of the Aboriginal people is Maria, who might have been named after that lagoon on the pit farm. He says, all right, you're going to have an inquest on this man. If your inquest says that the man is guilty of killing, of murder, then I'll let you know who it was. Isn't that amazing? So all these Aboriginal people gathered at Windsor to find out what was going to happen. They were all really nervous. And then they have the inquest in Sydney, and they decide that Robert Luttrell died because of his what they called interfering with Aboriginal women and breaking spears, which means breaking their property. And so they just said there was no case to answer. And the Aboriginal people were very relieved and they all left. And I thought, wasn't there a settler posse to go and get revenge for Robert Luttrell? No, there wasn't. It was all quiet because, you know what? He was a liability. The only follow-up bit I found out was that his brother joined the big parties that went out to kill Aboriginal people in 1816, and I'm sure that was motivated by revenge.
One of the Burruburrungal mob's most well-known ancestors, Maria Locke, was born around 1805 here in the Richmond lowlands and lived at Hobartville with the Luttrells. Maria was the daughter of the leader Yarramundi. She is my 6 times great-grandmother, and I am one of tens of thousands of Dharug people today that are her descendants. In 1814, when Maria was 9, she attended with Yarramundi's clan the inaugural annual meeting with Aboriginal people held by Governor Macquarie at Parramatta, and was admitted into the Native Institute, a school for Aboriginal children. She was an exceptional student, reported by teachers to be well in advance of her European and Aboriginal peers. In 1822, she married Bennelong's son, Dickie Bennelong, who was also a student at the Institute and a member of the Burraburungu clan through his mother. A farming settlement was established on Richmond Road near Plumpton for the newlyweds and others, with Macquarie returning small parcels of country to them. The place became known as the Blackstown, after which nearby Blacktown took its name. Dickie Bennelong died soon after marriage, and in 1824, Maria married Robert Locke, an illiterate convict carpenter who was working on the new Native Institute at Blacktown. Their marriage was the first officially sanctioned union between a convict and an Aboriginal woman, and Robert was assigned to her. In 1832, she petitioned the government for land that had been granted to her brother, Colby, at Blacktown. Through her persistence, this land was eventually granted to her in 1843.
Ngaya Jasmine Burraburungu Dharug Dalang. I am Jasmine from the Grey Kangaroo people of the Sydney Basin area. I am the 5 times great granddaughter of Maria Locke and the 3 times great granddaughter of Hannah Locke. Hannah Locke lived at McGrath Hill behind the pub on South Creek. My family have always lived along the Dyarubbin. Maria Locke, she's such a huge hero for so many of the Dharug mob, particularly the Burraburungu mob who we belong to. Her letter to the government is sort of the beginnings of identifying as Aboriginal, because in that letter she says, "You've promised to give us land, we the Aboriginal people of this place, and you need to honour what you have said to me." And the letter is extraordinary because she writes it in this really formal language that half of us would have trouble replicating today. What I have heard from my auntie is that she was known around the area as being a midwife, a healer, and that if you were pregnant, she was the one that they called. So I think that's fascinating, that tiny little bit of insight into Maria, because of course Maria had nearly 10 children who all had 10 children who had 10 children who had 10 children. So there's this huge amount of descendants from Yarramundi and Maria because of her. An extraordinary woman who needs to be celebrated.
As we head back along this Waradya lagoon towards the path, watch out for the birds. You can often see reed warblers, darters and cormorants here. Birdwatcher Mark Fuller.
That's the reed warbler warbling. Can you hear that really beautiful little song? He's just in the reeds here. He's making a little chip chip call. Very plain brown bird. There he is. And they have a beautiful nest, and quite often they'll use those bulrush sort of fluffy stuff. See, that's the magpie lark, you know, the peewee. A lot of the channels created by streams or waterways, it's like you can't build on waterways, and they're really the only natural corridors that are left now. Everything else that's open and flat is all perfect for houses. Looks like there's a darter on the other side with his wings. It's a darter, which is similar to a cormorant. They call it a snake bird because when they swim, that's the darter calling. So he's probably calling, saying, "I'm already here." It looks like some other birds, and the reason I worked out it was a darter, I looked at the shape of its tail, the pointiness of the beak. When you look at a darter's beak, it's more like a heron or an egret, where it's that sharp spear type one. But when you look at a cormorant, it's more of a fish trapping one. The darter's probably the bigger of the two. That's a little black cormorant. Again, you can see they've got that sort of bill, or fisherman's type bill. If you've got a darter, it means you've got fish. Well, you can see them moving in the middle there. And it's that balance, that thing of being part of the bigger picture.
Let's carefully cross over the road into Smith Park, named after Hannah Smith, wife of Edward Pugh. a free settler who was granted 100 acres near the lagoon in 1802. We're walking across what was once a natural wetland, an extension of the same lagoon we've just walked along. The wetland became an uncontrolled and illegal rubbish dump during the 1960s. Richmond Rotary Club initiated a reclamation project to clean it up and develop a public parkland beside the lagoon in 1972. Looking up to our right, you'll again see the ground rising towards the terrace, which is the town of Marrang Ngurra, Richmond, just off the floodplain. Richmond was one of Macquarie's 5 towns, declared in 1810 to encourage farmers to move up off their low-lying farms, which suffered repeated losses during flooding. Macquarie granted farmers small land grants in town, but most farmers didn't want to leave their farms.
The fringes of Smith Park up on the hill contain remnant native ground covers and understory of the original river flat eucalypt forest, which we call Dagga Dagga. Dagga Dagga covered these river flats before they were cleared by European settlers for farming. White cedar is believed to be the only remaining native canopy species in the park. Pughs Lagoon is an endangered ecological community under state government legislation. Just behind those trees on the hill is a historic precinct which includes St. Peter's Anglican Church and Cemetery. Buried up there is the well-known Richmond local, Margaret Catchpole, who arrived as a convict on the same ship as many of the local families, nursing their children on board, and came out to the Richmond area working for them as a nurse and midwife. She was an independent, enterprising, single woman and despite being a convict, managed to rent a small farm at Richmond. Hiring a man to work her land, she also bought and sold haberdashery and drapery items. Her letters, written in an idiosyncratic phonetic spelling, tell of the flooding in 1806, leading up to Macquarie's declaring of the 5 towns.
I was trying to save what I could, and then I and Mrs. Dyte and her 3 children went upon the loft for safety. We had not been there a bob, I swear, before the first chimney went down and the middle wire went. Then I expected the next chimney to go and all the wires, and then to be crashed to dead. The water was about 5 feet deep in the house at the time. It was that depth in about 2 hours. Mr. Dyte and his 2 men was on to knock down the pigsties and pig runs to drive the pigs away, so we were left alone. But great providences turned up a boat to save us from a watery grave and take us away. I was more frightened than all the way getting over. House and barns and wheat stacks and the India corn that was not gathered in washed all away before the stream. Some poor creatures riding on the housing, some on their barns crying out for God's sake to be saved, others firing their guns in the greatest distress for a boat.
Let's head along to the end of Smith Park, then we'll cross Francis Street to go back alongside the Waradya Lagoon. Gudugulung. Freshwater turtles are one of the creatures you often see in the Waradya Lagoon. Ecologist Dr. Michelle Ryan.
We have 2 species of freshwater turtles that live in the Hawkesbury River, Carlodina longicollis, the eastern long-necked turtle. The long-necked turtles prefer wetlands and farm dams. That's why we see them moving and crossing roads. So they will travel between the river, where they will reside more in drought time because there's better resources in the river. When the river starts drying or there's too much competition from other fish species or other turtles, they'll then move across land to try and find better resources in wetlands. And we have a short-necked species of turtle, Emiger macquarie. We find in the river they prefer flowing water. Freshwater turtles play a really important role in the river, play a huge role in nutrient cycling and breaking down dead species. So like if there's fish or something like a kangaroo, they really work to break that down and help clean up that water. So I looked at the freshwater turtle species here in the Hawkesbury, and specifically how humans are impacting the populations of those turtle species. So I collected roadkill around the Hawkesbury for about 2 years. We had a lot of turtles died from vehicle strikes. It has a really big impact because a female turtle can produce 1,200 hatchlings in its lifetime. Every time we lose a female turtle, we're losing that potential for more turtles. They live about 80 to 100 years, long-necked turtles, and they breed throughout their entire life. So once they stop being juveniles at about 10 to 14 years old, they will breed every year. And they lay about 20 eggs a year. Yeah, it's quite amazing. They will move a kilometre or more a day, and they will travel quite far between water bodies. They're a lot quicker than people think though, but yeah, they're only small and only have little legs.
Nalawa. Let's sit a while by the Waradya in this picnic shelter or Gamunwa under the she oaks. My people call this area Marrang Ngurra, sand camp or place of sands. Over millennia, Dyarubbin and the waterways that feed her have cut through the rock of Gulamata, the Blue Mountains, and brought tons of sand down onto the floodplain. Sand was dredged out of the river between Yarramundi and Richmond for the construction of Waradya Dam, amongst other projects. In 2001, a New South Wales Government geological survey identified 230 million tonnes of sand on Richmond lowlands, looking to meet the demand for construction sand. Current zoning, agriculture and wetlands such as this one are protecting much of that sand. Local historian and author of Hawkesbury Settlement Revealed, Jan Barclay-Jack.
The Aboriginal local tribe, which has been referred to as the Richmond Hill tribe, wandered as far afield as from Springwood, where they hunted larger animals like kangaroos, down through Yarramundi and along the river with dark canoes. They fished for mullet and eels.
Our people also use nets and boomerangs to capture waterbirds on the river and in lagoons. Dharug educator Aaron Wilkins.
Along the river system, the men would line up with their boomerangs and the women would string nets across a bend in the river. So when ducks fly, they fly close to the water. So when you come round the bend, they can't see that quickly and they fly into the net. When you're in a lagoon, it's very, very different. They will encircle the lagoon and throw the boomerangs across the lagoon. And because the ducks can't go anywhere because they're encircled, the ducks push themselves under the water. It takes a lot of energy for a duck to push itself under the water because of the predator. And then they're exhausted and you can literally walk in there and grab them.
The land between Yarramundi and what is today Cornwallis, having two small creeks and a lagoon, was ideal for their gathering, particularly in spring where the native shrubs are in flower and they could get honey and ants, which they ground up and they used the eggs of the ants too. And in autumn, when there were berries, it was a very prolific area for traditional food sources for them. And the interesting thing is that on several occasions in the early settlement, when the Europeans were alarmed by large numbers of Aboriginal people appearing at the back of the farms, it was always in spring. They never made the connection that this was their hunting ground in the springtime.
Cornwallis is over the eastern side of the Richmond lowlands, closer to Bulga, Narang, Windsor, and the Air Force Base, where there is a much larger lagoon known as Baker's Lagoon. Baker's Lagoon was a hotspot for violent clashes between Dharug people and European colonists in the 1790s.
From that initial meeting with the exploratory parties early on, where they were just assessing these visitors and thinking they were coming and then going, they soon found that once the settlers arrived in 1794, they not only had a different perception of what land was. It wasn't a communal owning that you could wander around according to the seasons. They had a piece of land, and they, for the first time in their lives, had property that they owned, and they regarded it as their own. They grew crops, and what really limited the access to the river was the fact that they weren't willing to share those crops with the Aboriginal people. They'd come in and they'd taken their traditional hunting lands and access to the river from them, and they shared their ducks and their kangaroos and all their traditional foods. But the settlers were not willing to share the corn with the Aboriginal people, and this was what became the sticking point. The fact that as they put more fences up, they couldn't get their traditional lands and they wouldn't share it. And so you got the guerrilla tactics, which were the only way that they could go when they needed food, was to just dive in and try and steal the corn from the paddocks. So very quickly, the access all along the river for many, many kilometres was impeded for them. It was only in those lands that the settlers rejected as having too high banks or more difficult in the early period where they could get access.
It seems that almost as soon as the settlers invaded Dharug country on the Hawkesbury, on Dyarubbin, that violence broke out. Things really came to a head in that very first year, in 1794, in September. Aboriginal people had no inkling, they could not have understood that the settlers were taking their land, because in their minds, in their beliefs, they're indivisible from land. And so, of course, they kept using the land as they normally did. And when we think about those early farms, they're 30 acres, small farms by present-day standards, but the farmers were only using that very front part on the rivers, the alluvial part, and then the backs of them were still bush, and they weren't fenced. So, of course, Aboriginal people kept using them. They kept walking through them. They kept moving around their sacred sites and ritual grounds and camping grounds, just like they had done for thousands of years. And one day in September 1794, at Cornwallis, a group of Aboriginal people were seen at the back of a farm, and they were just in the bush part, and the settlers saw them there and thought they were going to attack. And a boy came forward, and the settlers grabbed him and tied him up and tortured him by dragging him back and forth through a fire. And then they threw him in the river, still bound, and shot him dead. Now, his people would have seen that happen. If you try to think of it from a Dharug point of view, we know that young boys in Aboriginal society generally were sent forward often as envoys, as people who could make communication with the other group. That's possibly what this boy was sent to do. The settlers later said they thought he was coming to spy on them to see if they had guns, and said they didn't have guns. That wasn't true. In Aboriginal law, if you commit a crime like that, you have to pay the price. It has to be an equanimity in justice. So the person who commits the crime, or their relative or their countryman, must pay a price. And that is what happened. The Dharug attacked a neighbour, George Shadrach, and his servant, and beat them and speared them so badly they nearly died. That was obviously payback for the loss of this boy. But there were lots of raids. Dharug people raiding the farms, taking all the food and the clothing in an attempt to drive out these invaders. Now, when the news of this boy's torture and killing got back to Sydney, the authorities actually were alarmed. It seemed as though the settlers here were completely out of control. And so there was an inquiry, and the person they put in charge of it was Captain John MacArthur. However, the inquiry didn't go very far because the people giving evidence covered for each other. They insisted they thought they were being threatened or spied on, and in the end, it wasn't thought important enough to pursue, and so the matter fizzled out. Of course, it didn't fizzle out back on the Hawkesbury. Probably a little bit later that year, maybe September, October, the settlers formed up in a posse, rounded up all their guns, went to an unknown place, probably early in the morning, and found a camp of Aboriginal people and shot into them, killing 7 or 8 people. We don't know where this was, we don't know who the people were, but that massacre is recorded, and it's the first recorded massacre perpetrated by settlers in modern Australian history.
You go back a million years, most of these birds were still here, the plants were still here, the hangover from the dinosaurs, and of course what's happened in the last 200 years has been completely traumatic, and unfortunately it's what's happening now, the 21st century. I do worry, I am very concerned with the way that the environment has declined. White-faced heron, 2 of them. The white-face is probably the most common and the most adaptable. The herons are a great one because when conditions are wet, they'll eat fish. When conditions are half and half, they'll eat frogs and tadpoles. And then when conditions are dry, they'll eat skinks. So they'll go from grassland to reed bed to shallow water. This time of year there's a lot of breeding, but there's so much carnage. You know, you can see a duck swimming along with 5 chicks. The next day it's got 4, the next day it's got 3, the next day it's got 2, until there's none left. And then they breed again. It's like there's a lot of hit and miss there. The pink-eared duck and the shoveler, they really like shallow water. If you can see their bill, they've got these sifting bills, like huge bills. You can see them even from a distance. And they'll sort of suck it in like a soup strainer. Whatever it is they're eating, those invertebrates turn up in shallow water when there's just enough temperature, light and everything else. So there's little invisible stuff going on that you really don't know about until you start trying to work it out. We sort of don't appreciate, generally. Australia has still got that hangover of that colonial type thing that nature is there to be battled with. And it's us versus nature. There's a lack of respect which comes from a lack of understanding. The more people understand these things, the more amazing it is.
Yanma, let's walk slowly back along Pughs Lagoon towards where we started. There are often lots of ducks on the grass along here, so take care of the ducks. Ecologist Dr. Michelle Ryan.
Pughs Lagoon is a really well-loved area, so lots of people take their children down there to feed ducks. There's a huge population of different breeds of domestic ducks that aren't native to Australia, as well as geese that are currently living at Pughs Lagoon, which is devastating. I feel people dumping their pets, but it's also really bad for the ecosystem because that wetland hasn't developed with those species there. Also, people come and feed them bread. It's a huge problem. Native animals or animals shouldn't be fed bread, for one, but it creates a pollution source in that wetland. So we see this excess of bread come in, the turtles and the fish species might eat the bread, and it can cause different bacteria and things to grow. So we've had a few cases of botulism in the ducks and things in that wetland.
The Aboriginal people of Richmond were still gathering here in a paddock opposite a pub called the Welcome Inn, which overlooked the lagoon in the 1840s, where old Kurrajong Rd, the road up ahead, left town for the ferry punt that crossed the river.
It's interesting to think about how Aboriginal people responded to the invasion of their country. Obviously, there was frontier violence that went on for almost 20 years, but they never actually left this country. They never were driven out. They certainly weren't all killed off, although the killings were dreadful and the suffering was unimaginable. But for Aboriginal people, their country was still their country. They continued as long as they could to visit their places, to hold their ritual meetings, to hold their legal contests, the great contests where people stood trial. They would still turn up well into the 1860s at the important corroboree grounds, like Emu Plains or at Yarramundi. But what also happened was that they sometimes just adopted settler places which were very public and continued with their rituals there. Now, Pughs Lagoon here at Richmond is one place which had likely been a meeting ground because lagoons were very popular places for people to meet. They had everything you needed. But there are records of a contest still being held here, above Pughs Lagoon actually, in the 1840s, in front of a pub, with settlers looking on. It's amazing to think of that overlaid Dharug settler landscape. And very important to remember that Dharug people kept their traditions going as long as they could, moved across their country as long as they could too.
Renowned Impressionist artist Charles Conder painted Pughs Lagoon in 1888 while staying with Julian Ashton's painting group at Griffiths Farm along the river at Richmond. His painting of the lagoon is displayed on the green signpost from the Hawkesbury Artists' Trail under the Gummun, she oaks, just near Old Kurrajong Rd. It wasn't long after this painting, in 1892, that Richmond's first water supply was pumped from the river at North Richmond. It remained untreated until 1911. In 1926, an elevated reservoir was erected near St Peter's, the church on the hill above the lagoon, to maintain pressure during the hours of peak demand and to ensure no interruption of supply. Pughs and other lagoons on the floodplain were pumped from for agriculture even earlier, in the late 1800s.
Mr S. Borton is at present engaged in erecting a McCormick's Patent Prize water lifter, which cost £70, on land occupied by a party of Chinese gardeners at Richmond Lagoon. There are about 20 acres of land. It is leased by Mr Ahu from Mr Onus, who is supplying him with the pump. Water will be raised by horsepower, and it will be allowed to flow over the whole of the land, which is sloping from the lagoon bank. To show what the Chinese have done during the present season, it may be said that they have taken 200 bushels of peas a week for 3 weeks. These they sent to the Sydney markets and obtained good prices. Windsor and Richmond Gazette, 9 November 1889.
In your own time, you might like to head carefully back over the road and return to where we started. Find a place to sit if you like. When the river rises in flooding and spills over its banks, it reclaims its old course, spreading itself over this flat, low-lying floodplain. Floods usually leave a layer of silt that can be several feet deep, making the soil fertile and rich for agriculture. Colonists initially grew wheat and maize, then came dairy, vegetables and fruit, and more recently turf and horses. Local farmers still pump water from lagoons on the floodplain. Arthur Parkes moved to the Richmond lowlands near Baker's Lagoon in 1934. He was a dairy, vegetable and turf farmer. Interviewed by historian and author Sue Rosen in 1992 for her book Losing Ground, an environmental history of the Hawkesbury Nepean catchment.
Well, when we first came here in 1934, you could drink the water anywhere at all, even Baker's Lagoon. I wouldn't have any hesitation in pulling up along any of those creeks and getting a billy full of water out to drink. When we first came here, it was all dairy. Everything in the Hawkesbury was dairy. But we used to milk about 20 by hand and still make a living. All the work was done with horses, no tractors, in 1934. But none of the farmers had much. They lived practically off the land when we came here. They killed their own meat and they killed their own pigs and made their own butter and they drank their own milk and they grew a bit of vegetable. And were dairying for quite a while after the war. They didn't have many cows. I think there were 117 suppliers at the Hawkesbury factory. When it closed, I think there was about 3 left, but they were bigger. They all got bigger. They'd milked 700-800 cows now. I'd say in the 60s, excuse the dairy and die. The milk factory ended up closing down in Windsor, where we used to deliver milk to. But before the war, we used to deliver it in horse and cart and milk cans. After the war, the floods came in 1949. 38 floods in 7 years. 38 times they'd come up and go down. And being a little bit intrepid, I'd have the ground cultivated before the next flood and planted, where the other farmer, a bit lazy, wouldn't. And I was losing more than they were. There's one farm in Cornwallis. When the white man came here first and took it up, it was 40-odd acres. There's only 2 acres left on this side of the river now, all the rest on the other side of the river. I started growing vegetables entirely and gave the dairies away in the end. Because the vegetables weren't much good, we couldn't get any money for them. The thing that knocked the vegetables mostly in the district here was the interstate transport. They'd bring them from Melbourne and all over the place. And then they started bringing potatoes from Western Australia. Found a lot of Aboriginal axes down here. I found 30-odd Aboriginal axes around the lagoon. We used to grow potatoes, and the potato digger would bring them up with the potatoes. And the potato pickers wouldn't know what they were, but I'd be going along and I'd see these things left on the ground, these stones. I gave some to the museum in there. There's still a few market gardens going, but very few. You'd think turf would be taking away a lot of dirt, which you slice it off this thick, but it's not really taking away much at all, because usually after you cut the turf, you get foul manure and you put on. By the time you put the foul manure on, after you cut it, and then particularly coicea grass, in the summer you cut that twice a week, mow it, and the cuttings from the mowing are all left on top. And by the time you come to cut it all you're really cutting off, and not, you're not cutting soil, it looks like soil, but it's the foul manure and the cuttings.
With its mighty catchment starting near Goulburn, the Hawkesbury River system, the largest coastal river system in New South Wales, supplies Sydney with about 98% of its drinking water. Along its whole length, treated wastewater is also discharged into the river system. Baker's Lagoon, one of the largest lagoons in Dyarubbin's floodplain, is where the treated wastewater from Richmond's Air Force Base has been released since the 1960s. Richmond's floodplain and community is dealing with contamination from PFAS, firefighting foam, which travels through this wastewater system. Dr. Jason Reynolds, research lecturer from the School of Science and Health at Western Sydney University.
In the case of Richmond, and in the case of Williamstown and Newcastle and Oakey in Queensland and up in Katherine and Northern Territory, they all coincide with the presence of an Air Force base. And the issue's always been on the use of firefighting foams, which contains these PFAS compounds as like a surfactant, as a material that generates bubbles that can choke out oxygen around a fire. And when we look at a place like Richmond, the contamination source is coming from the wastewater treatment plant as they discharge their water onto the floodplain. In this case, it goes down into the lagoon system. So the properties on either side of that channel that drains into the lagoon are heavily contaminated with PFAS. And it has little to do with the firefighting foam, and it has a lot more to do with the way that we use and regulate wastewater treatment plants, both directly into the Hawkesbury Nepean and onto land use itself. There are already reports released by the RAF base through their consultancy, the AECOM, that have told everyone that there are PFAS all through the lowlands of Richmond, and have advised not to eat too much of anything that comes out of that area, and to be very careful if you have chickens in your backyard, not to handle contaminated soil in the Richmond lowlands area. And that's causing concern for farmers on the lowlands. There's a leasehold for some cattle on there, and that farmer's particularly concerned. There's some moderate to low level agricultural productivity, pecan farmers, vegetable farmers. They're all growing on PFAS contaminated soil. And so this becomes an issue from a human health perspective. We're trying to follow whether it's making its way all the way to the Hawkesbury or is it getting stuck in the lowlands in the lagoon system. Western Sydney University is researching PFAS, looking at ways that we can remediate the land and looking at ways that we can clean it up, because at the moment there is no easy way to repair the land. If it was contaminated soil, as is on the RAF base directly at Richmond, they simply scrape it up and put it into a furnace and burn it at 1200 degrees. They ash it. Obviously that takes time, that takes energy and some significant cost. We are looking at ways that we can remove these compounds in a more safe and easier fashion, such as growing certain types of grass or trees or crops that might rapidly soak up the PFAS, and then we can harvest that, and then that's much easier to handle.
Kevin Rizzoli served the Hawkesbury as our longest standing local member of New South Wales Parliament from 1973 to 2003 and advocated tirelessly for the river, establishing the Hawkesbury Nepean Catchment Management Trust, a New South Wales government regulatory authority which looked after the whole Hawkesbury Nepean catchment from 1993 till it was axed overnight in 2001. Kevin grew up in Richmond and recalls all the floods since 1949.
The biggest flood in living history is 1961. The biggest flood in recorded history was in 1867. Don't worry about the 1867 flood. If we got one of those today, I really don't know to think what would happen. But if we got even a 1961 flood again, the devastation to Sydney would be enormous, because the 1961 got well up South Creek. It was over the railway station in Riverstone, and that's when we lost our water supply, which was an interesting experience. Richmond in those days was cut off completely, which was a problem in itself, and it actually flooded the airstrip at Richmond Air Base. All you could do was to spend the day driving around looking at how far the flood had come up. We got back from doing this, the family, Mum, who loved a cup of tea, said, I'll put the jug on for a cup of tea, turn on the water, no water. And we'd lost our water supply. So for 2 days, I think it was, we survived on about, from that little reservoir down near St Peter's Church, which has a very limited amount of water in it, on about 4 gallons of water a day, which was about all you could do was to drink it. Another feature of flooding in the Hawkesbury is that Londonderry floods very early, but then drains. So whilst the flood was still well over North Richmond Bridge and Windsor Bridge, the road from Penrith became open. So they brought all the water tankers up that flushed the streets in Sydney, and they would bring the water across from Penrith. You'd just fill up some buckets, that's all you did. We managed to get out to some farmer friends of mine. All their tanks were absolutely running over. So they lent us a milk churn, which we filled with water, put in the seat of my brother's Morris Minor and carted back home. So we were a little bit better off than some people for a while until this steady supply of water came through. But yes, you just carted it in and they came around, half a dozen times a day.
It's thought that Dyarubbin, our name for the river, could mean watercourse, and also yams, a major food source for our people which grew on the riverbanks, and which we cultivated sustainably, as recorded by Governors Phillip and Hunter on the early exploratory trips. Dharug educator Aaron Wilkins.
When we talk about farming, especially in regards to the yams were like vines, a natural vegetation, a tuber fruit. We would dig them up, take what was needed, and then replant them down. The way that we obtained our food was always in the thought of not to be greedy, not to take in excess, and to always leave it for future days ahead. We cultivated, we were respectful to the food source, respectful to Mother Earth.
Dharug culture here on Dyarubbin was forced underground in the wake of colonisation and into the 20th century, where the taking of children became institutionalised and racism entrenched, with language and culture being carefully guarded or not passed on at all. Burrabirrungal artist Leanne Watson is a descendant of Maria Locke, daughter of Yarramundi, who was born here near Pughs Lagoon.
My mother's spoken to me a lot of times about when her nan and family spoke fluent Dharug, And when the children would come anywhere near them, they'd shush because they didn't want the children to speak the language because they'd get taken. So a lot of the stories that we did have weren't passed down at that time. My grandmother's mother and father would have known the stories, and my grandmother probably did know the stories as well, but they wouldn't pass them on to the children. My grandmother was taken by the Aboriginal Protection Board and she was sold to a white man. When my nan was living with her grandfather at Rooty Hill, they were still learning a lot of cultural practices, but it wasn't passed on because of the fear of the kids being taken. I think a lot of the cultural stuff that we lost here was picked up staying with other mobs all over, all through Northern Territory and all up through Queensland and different places. And we were taught very culturally, like you sit, you listen, don't speak up, look after your elders, like the manners around culture we were brought up with, because you'd be harshly told off if you didn't act appropriately. I used to try and pretend that I wasn't Aboriginal growing up because there was so much racism. My mum had a really hard time in school. She can't really talk about it because it was that horrendous. When I got to 18, I thought, well, Mum was teaching in schools culture. That's when I sort of really embraced it.
Sound, and one of the words that we use a lot and that you probably would have heard of is Dyarubbin. So it's DY, but we say it like Dyarubbin without that puff of air. Dyarubbin. Ngurra means country.
Ngurra.
Everyone say Ngurra.
All across Australia, languages are being revitalised, are being welcomed back, are being used. Language is the biggest part of healing country, I think. It's the biggest help for mental health because it gives you your literacy in your own language. And what could be more engaging than that? It's incredible. Language is everything.
The last thing was learning goodbye, and we should all know it.
Yanu.
Dharug educators Jasmine Seymour and Rhiannon Wright with Aboriginal students at Windsor South Public School. We hope you've enjoyed 11 stories from the River Dyarubbin's Pughs Lagoon audio walk. For more information, please see the Hawkesbury Regional Museum website. There are 10 other audio walks along Dyarubbin you might like to do.
Nabawunya, see you soon. Remember Mitiga. This Ngurra country is alive with the Gumada spirit of our Wurundjat ancestors who've cared for this country for countless generations. Tread softly on the streaming. Take care of Dyarubbin. We were strong here. We remain strong here. We will always be strong here.